everyone. Welcome to Wise Words of Women. I'm here with Lindsay Williams. Thank you so much for coming, Lindsay.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Could you, for a start, give us a kind of snapshot as to who you are, what you do, to kick off this conversation?
Yeah, no problem. So I am Lindsay of Lindsay Does Languages, which has existed in one form or another. I'm sure we'll get to that since 2012. So it's been a while now. But right now, my focus over the past few years and, going into the future is all about teaching people how to learn languages. So, I used to kind of explicitly teach French, English, Spanish, and then I kind of pivoted because I decided that wasn't quite what I wanted to do. It wasn't quite the focus I wanted. And actually, I realized that what was missing in a lot of it was the how-to. So that's what I do. I work with teachers as well who want to start teaching languages online. And yeah, all together within Lindsay Does Languages.
That sounds great. And so I think my first question would be kind of, what's your relationship with multilingualism? How did you first get into languages?
So that's an interesting question because it's not like there was an obvious inroad for me. I came from a monolingual family in a relatively, at that time, kind of nowhere quite monolingual, but, a relatively sort of monolingual town in the middle of England. There was nothing drastic that kind of was like, oh, that. But what did happen is we would go on camping holidays to France. And I would waddle up to the little boulangerie and order my baguettes in French. And I used to enjoy that. And then when I was in primary school, probably kind of connected for the same reason, my mum said, oh, do you want to go to French club? And I said, okay, I'll try, because I enjoyed going on holiday to France. And when I went, they gave you croissants at the end of term. So we just played games and had croissants. And that was enough for me to kind of then, want to keep going and want to keep renewing. But what happened was, after those few years, when I then went on to secondary school and started French, that hadn't been the norm for a lot of people. They hadn't necessarily had the opportunity in primary school. And so we started from zero. So sort of age 11, I'm there in French class for the next couple of years, asking my teacher, oh, how do I say this? How do I do that? And being told, oh, no, stick to what we're doing, which for me was boring because it was just repeating. So I kind of fell out of love with French, and that very easily could have been the end of it for me. But for the fact that I had discovered, I really liked music, and I discovered Shakira, whose album Laundry Service was kind of very bilingual, in particular, the fact that there were some songs that were the same song in English and in Spanish. So, right. So I wanted to translate that. And when then it came to picking options for GCSE, so kind of, a couple of years on again, Spanish was available, but it had never been an option in my school before. We just got a new Spanish teacher. He was like really cool. He had like the jazzy whiteboard and all of the tech, people really wanted to do Spanish. But for me, that wasn't it. I just wanted to do Spanish because I enjoyed this music that I'd found. But my school said, if you want to do Spanish or German, because they'd suddenly opened up German out of nowhere, you have to do French because that proves that you can do languages. And so I very accidentally became sort of multilingual from that young age, just for the fact that the school had said, you want to do Spanish, you got to do French. And I think without that, I probably would have stopped French, kept going with Spanish for a few years, maybe fallen in love with it and kept going longer, but wouldn't have then had the confidence perhaps or the drive to then go on and do more. So I'm really grateful for that it just made it really normal from such a young kind of impressionable age that you can learn multiple languages at once. And so it's never been something that I've been afraid of or, kind of needed to finish one language before another. It's always just felt like the most normal part of language learning for me is that there's one and then there's another and maybe another at the same time.
So does that mean you went on and studied it at A level? And for people who don't know the British education system, this is the exams you do after your main school years and before university. Was that the case?
Yeah, so A level I did French and Spanish, and I did drama and theatre studies. Nice. And for the first year I did psychology as well. But then I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do, right? I just knew that they were the subjects that I'd enjoyed, that I wanted to do more of. I knew that languages were like a useful thing because you get told that all the way through. But I didn't know what was going to come next. And in my secondary school, it was very much like you go to school, you leave school, and you're on your own. There was no talk about university or careers or anything really like that. But then when I went on to the sixth form, it was a very, very different school. It was still a secondary school, but with a sixth form attached. And yeah, week one, they're like, right, okay, guys, UCAS application. Here's how we apply to university. I was like, you know what now? What are we, is this suddenly a thing that has to happen in my life? What? I don't get it. And so that was a really kind of like a culture shock in a way, that difference between the two schools. And I still wasn't quite sure because it's like, well, why am I going to go and pay all this money and get in all this debt for something when I don't know what I want at the end of it? It's not like I want to be a doctor and there is this very clear defined path, or I want to be a teacher and there is this clear defined path of what I need to study and all of that. And so I sort of reluctantly applied with a year kind of deferred so that I had this space to kind of figure it out a bit. And I had a travel kind of experience booked with teaching English in Costa Rica for 3 months. So I worked a bit, went to Costa Rica, came back, worked a bit more, and was like, I want to go to this university thing. I want to travel more. I want to see all these places that I've just discovered you can see and experience for a lot cheaper than you'd kind of been led to believe at that era, at that point, at that age, where it's very much like, holidays beyond this sphere of Western Europe are very expensive and only for certain types of people, you know? And so that had suddenly become open to me. And that's what I wanted to explore. I didn't want to go into some random UK city for 4 years, like, and not know what was coming at the end of it. So I worked a little bit more, kind of did all these really random odd jobs. I was working in a petrol station. I worked in a laboratory for a flower lab. And then I discovered the Open University, because I knew that despite all of this, I still wanted to learn languages. I just knew that there was going to be another way to do that. Like, surely university can't be the only way that you can learn a language. I was very aware of that. And so I discovered the Open University kind of by chance. Signed up, did the thing, and because it's part-time and it's distance learning, it's like 6 years instead of 3 or 4. So there's this really longer chunk of your life that you're doing this, that you're needing to be dedicated to this thing for, and that you can do other things. So I worked, I traveled, I started my business, all whilst doing the degree at the same time, which is something that I'm really, grateful to have had the chance to discover that was an option, because that was definitely the better option for me.
And what did you study?
So I studied modern language studies. Mm-hmm. And this is also then when it kind of begins to diverge a little bit more. So the first year of French and Spanish, I'd already done. That was basically getting you up to A level. And I was like, well, I don't want to repeat it again. I'll just do something new. And they had Italian courses, and Chinese was a new one. They had German, they had Welsh. And I was like, let's go Italian, because that will be easier, more connected to the French and Spanish. And let's go Chinese, because when am I going to get the chance to learn that again, right? And so that's what I did for the first year. I did some English linguistics stuff in the middle, and then just the French and Spanish all the way to the end. But then throughout, you're able to kind of add stuff on, take on as much as you want to. So I did some Italian extra courses, and I did German as well from scratch. Wow. With the Open University at the same time. So yeah, it was
a
very
lot
much
of at the same time.
Honestly, I cannot speak highly enough of the Open University, because they're so they know what they're doing. Like, they've been doing this like distance learning thing now for I think over 50 years at this point. Back when, I mean, you probably remember, Lucy, when it would be on TV at like 4 a.m. And if you were studying at that era, you'd have to sort of set your VCR to record things. So they know what they know how to get stuff out and how to do it in the most kind of up to speed way, which was very different then from my experience with a different university to do my master's. Which, yeah.
I mean, we'll definitely come on to that in a minute, but whilst I have you kind of in this period of your life, I think what I'm really curious about is how you decided to set up your business and what the process was, and also in terms of your mindset, because what I find at the moment is on social media, what I see is it's like everyone's an entrepreneur right now. That's the impression that you get, everyone's creating their own stuff. And even though that isn't necessarily strictly true, there are lots of people who are doing amazing stuff online that I see. Whereas if I compare who I know, in real life, that's not reflective of it. But when you did that, it wasn't something that was going around online all the time that might have allowed you to be inspired by others. Was it a solitary process? Did you have a good support network? What made you decide I'm going to do this, and what kind of kept you motivated?
So when I started with Open University, there was this everything changed within like 2 weeks. I moved out and into a flat with some friends. I started with the Open University degree, and I started a new job. So I was working in a school because I thought, like, the things that you do with languages are that you teach or you translate. Like, they are the two things. These are your two paths. Choose one of them. There is nothing else you can do, which is obviously not true, but that's very much what you're fed at a young age, right? And so I thought, well, I'll probably teach, because that feels more like something I would enjoy more than translation. So I got this job in a school, and it really tied in nicely because I was able to work mostly in the language department, and really then experience it from the inside. I was a learning support assistant, so I was in the classrooms seeing people teach like all day, apart from when you're having to go out and tell people off for not wearing their tie or something stupid. And I was able to actually experience it firsthand before doing a PGC and doing all the qualifications, and then going into school and discovering I hated it. And so, which would have really
useful information,
right? And happens to so many people. It's a real shame. But the first job, I was there for basically 2 years, sort of a year, almost 2 school years. And then I had this gap in my Open University studies. And so I went to travel, and I came back, got the same job in a different school, but I hated it. And that's when I started my business. I was at the second one for 3 months. And so from January to April, left on Friday the 13th.
Oh, okay.
and registered my business on Monday the 16th of April.
Wow.
And then it was all throughout that, I'd gone from like having, low paid, but more money than you've ever had in your life at 19 jobs, to then suddenly being paid pro rata, like $9,000 a year. Like it really frustrates me no end how the least paid and least qualified staff in schools are the ones expected to work with the most difficult pupils. It's such a bizarre system that we have set up, at least in this country. But that was the way it was. And so I'm like, well, I finish at 3:30 and like I have all these weeks in the summer. Like, what am I going to do? Like, I don't have, I'm not earning enough money to like just go on holiday for all of these holiday weeks that I have. What do I do? And I was talking to a friend who was studying to be a doctor. She knew, right? She had the path. And she's like, oh, well, a lot of my friends tutor. And I was like, can I do that though? I'm still learning. Oh yeah, they're still learning. I'm like, oh, is that allowed? Yeah, you just do it online. I was like, okay. So for the couple of years that I'd been working in the school, I had a small handful of people that I'd been working with after school doing tuition, doing like private tuition for French and for Spanish, not for English at this point, but for French and for Spanish, driving around after work to people's houses with my little bag, my little like tiny whiteboard and all my little games and stuff. And I enjoyed that. That was really good. And it gave me the chance to teach myself, right? And so then when I left the second school, I wasn't completely high and dry. Like I had this plan. I knew, well, I've got this number of students. If I have the time, let's go. Let's make it full time. And because I was earning such a low salary, I just said to myself, if I can make more money on my own doing this than I would be in a school, then I'll stick it out after a year. If I make less money, I can just get another job. It's no big deal. I've tried and I know it didn't work. And yeah, so it was kind of an easy goal because it was such a low salary that I made more money. And I was like, oh, this is good. And so, yeah, so it just kind of, it flowed in from these little bits of teaching on the side and kind of experimenting to then being able to have the chance to go full time. And yeah, sometimes I think you just need that, like that second job. If it was the first job, I might not have jumped. But because in the second job, it was so horrendous. It was just awful and not fun.
Why was it so horrendous?
There were so many more people doing the same job. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say it was a bigger school, maybe slightly bigger, but not really. But they had so many more learning support assistants that you were just a number. Like no one really knew your name. You weren't going into the same department. So I was barely in language lessons. I was attached to the actual kid I was attached to was really, really sweet. But then there were these two boys in her class that I was supposed to like sort of also monitor. And just, you know, kids that don't appreciate you or deserve your time and effort. And I was like, I'm not here for this. Like, there's so many other things I could be doing with my time and my life. So like one of the first jobs that I had under Lindsay Does Languages was, and it's one of those things that like you would never think of, but it's just who you know, right? And it was teaching English in a garlic bread factory where they'd had this
garlic bread factory,
right? Wow. I'm never going to like approach a garlic bread factory on my own and think they need me. You need my English teaching skills. But it was just a coincidence of it was one of the parents of who I'd been teaching for a while who worked for the company. And yeah, so that was really cool because they'd had like this influx of orders and stuff. And so they needed someone to come in. They needed all the staff. They didn't interview them. They just got them in from agencies. Then they needed to make them permanent. So then no one could speak to anyone. So the Polish people could speak to the Polish people, the Hungarians to the Hungarians, Lithuanians to Lithuanians, etc., etc. But then in terms of health and safety, if someone needs to say, the machine is going to be set, the machine's on fire or whatever, right, leave the building. Like the English skills weren't there because they hadn't tested that because they were temporary staff originally. And so they got me in to then kind of level people out a little bit in terms of English.
Did they give you a classroom space or were you kind of had the garlic bread behind you?
Just in the background. No, we had like a classroom space where I'd go into. And yeah, it was good. It was good fun. It was a nice mix because a lot of the work was in the evening, right? So like from sort of 4 till 8 p.m, you're driving around like in rush hour traffic from house to house. And so that job was great because it was daytime. I had these 2 days each week when I would be in the factory, and then the rest of the time at home kind of planning lessons and stuff. So yeah, that was like really, really early days. But yeah, from the very beginning, like it was just, let's go, let's do this. And I was lucky enough that all the hard work paid off and it worked.
And I think that's such a great story in terms of kind of messages for anyone thinking about starting a business, that networking is such a massive part of that, because you can kind of plan till the cows come home and think about, you know, how am I going to do XYZ? But there's no way, presumably, that you had a list anywhere where you said, right, one stream of income, the garlic
bread factory. No. Exactly.
So talk me through Lindsay Does Languages, because it's a service, right? So you sign up, is it for a course, and you've got, what's the format of your material? Is it videos? Is it written content? How does it work?
So there's a few different ways. So there's like a couple of kind of digital products. Then there's some mini online courses that are all self-study. And then there's Language Life, where we work, like there's the self-study element of it, but then we work together sort of with the human support as well.
Okay.
And yeah, so then in terms of teaching, it's kind of similar. There's a couple of digital products, and then there's the main like online teaching starter kit, where we're in it together and I'm there and I'm giving that support as well. So it's kind of a hybrid of of different methods, because the thing is, like, there's only so much that you can learn sat on a 1 hour Zoom call in that very traditional one-on-one lesson sense. And equally, there's only so much that you can learn from self-study methods. And so having that blend, I've found, is kind of the best way to really provide all of the elements that piece it together. It's a bit like language learning itself, right? Like if you just speak, you're probably not going to be able to write or read as well. But if you just read and listen and consume and don't ever try and practice, then you're going to struggle when you want to practice. So it's blending the things together to create a balance that really works. So yeah, that's how it is.
As well, you've got 2 podcasts, haven't you?
Teach Languages Online and How to Learn a Language. Yeah.
And so is the Teach one, is that a newer project? Because I was aware of, and I've listened to and really enjoy How to Learn a Language, whereas the new one I only discovered the Teach one I only discovered recently.
They're both kind of sort of evolutions, I guess, of what's been before. So in terms of the podcast, if you scroll all the way back into the podcast feed, it's Language Stories, which was something that I absolutely adored. It was a language documentary series that I made traveling in Latin America and Southeast Asia. And there's video episodes as well. But then there's the podcast feed. And that was the first podcast that I ever made. And How to Learn a Language is now in that same feed. So it's all together. So you can scroll back and catch up. But then when I came back from that trip, I was like, I like the kind of method of podcasting. It feels good to me. Let's do the same sort of thing for teachers, like to talk about all of that stuff. And so Teach Languages Online started like years ago, like sort of 2018, something like that.
Hey.
And then sort of went on hiatus, kind of over COVID. Everything was a bit like, whoo. And then, yeah. And so now both of them exist. How to Learn a Language as How to Learn a Language is new from this year, from 2023, kind of January time, I think, literally at the start of the year. And then Teach Languages Online, I bought back just a couple of months ago now. So sort of in the summer of 2023 too.
Nice. All right. And then this is all really interesting. And I'm assuming that everything you're describing, the podcast, building content online, I'm assuming you taught yourself how to do all of these techie things. How was that like as a journey?
Pretty much. I mean, there's obviously been moments where I've joined courses and I've been in different programs and stuff. But yeah, more or less it's been sort of me. And what's it been like? I think I'm quite a sort of independent person anyway. And so I like the sense of achievement of learning something new. Like I really like to learn and to understand how things work. And so when you get the chance to be like, oh, how are we gonna like write a blog article? What's the best way to do that? How can we make that better? You know, I love all of that. And how are we gonna do email? What does that look like? And what's like that to me is really interesting. And so yeah, that's kind of why I've never sort of like directly outsourced it for long term or like hired anyone to do anything, because I enjoy learning about all these different areas and things. I do have an accountant. That bit I'm like, yeah, you can do.
So you've got, you know, at this point you've got all of this going on, and at this point you decide that you're going to go back to uni again. Am I right?
Yeah, a couple of years ago in COVID. So it was something I've been thinking about, kind of inspired by Language Stories and making that. And towards the end of that, sort of thinking, what is this? What is it that I'm interested in? What is the thing? Right. And obviously I knew like loosely what linguistics was. I'd done the module in my undergraduate degree. And then I discovered like the concept of like applied linguistics. And I was like, that's it. That's the thing I want. That's what I want to do
I
and
have
know
to say,
more
I
about.
have absolutely no idea what that means. So please give us a definition.
In very simple terms, it's linguistics, which is the science of language, and it's applied. So whereas linguistics itself, you could say, is maybe more sort of theoretical or like, research, applied linguistics is that little step more practical, really. That's the basic definition of what it is. And then obviously there's lots of branches of what that looks like. So there were modules that I did about like sociolinguistics, which is like the best bit. Psycholinguistics. There was something about like language and new media and all of these things that actually really together kind of tied into everything that I didn't realize I was working towards and doing until that point. So I thought about it for a bit. And then end of 2019, I went to the university for an open day. And I was like, hi, I'm here to ask about your applied linguistics, about the distance option. What's the difference? And I was met with we don't have anyone come and ask about that. Can you not just come here for a year and do it? It's like, wow, you are in your bubble. Completely like, no, I don't want that. And like, who can just be like, yeah, dropping life, going to, and so I was kind of put off. I thought, well, if they don't know anything at the open day, they probably don't care. It's probably just a bit of a secondary option. I'm not going to bother. But then obviously when COVID happened and you're all at home and you're thinking, how long is this going to go on for? I was like, screw it, I'm going to do it. Like, I know how to do distance learning. It doesn't matter what the material is like. I know that I'll be able to do a good job of it. And so I started that in July 2020 and finished, that was 2.5 years, and then finished in January this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Right. Okay. So it's quite recent. And because I know you speak Guarani as well, how was that linked? And actually, in fact, kind of as part of this, I remember watching you doing during COVID on your YouTube channel a language marathon, because you can tell me about it, because you planned to do a real marathon, right? And anyway, tell me about that in a sec. But my main question was, how had you gone from the kind of story that we've just heard with the French, German, Italian, Spanish, Mandarin, to in that marathon you spoke significantly more languages than that? So
there's a bit missing, isn't there?
Yeah, how that all happened.
That's a very good question. So the language marathon, basically I was supposed to run an actual marathon on that day when I did the Langathon, and it didn't happen because COVID. And I was like, well, I've still got this day that I was like, hyped for and ready to go. I was like, let's make something of that day, even if we can't go outside. So I just booked loads of lessons on Italki in each of the languages that I'd studied up to that point. So like one each, and just went from like 6 a.m. to sort of 7 p.m. probably, maybe like 8 p.m. with a bit of lunch gap. It was good fun. It was good fun. And I did it the following year. I didn't do it this year. I can't remember why. There was a reason. But I might do it in the autumn, we'll see, or next year, because it's a nice chance. When you learn lots of languages, like the most difficult thing is then maintaining what you've done in all of them to like that same level, and then continuing to advance, right? Finding the time for all of that is just not always possible. And so having this was a really good reminder and a nice refresher as well for like, actually, I'm quite good at some of these languages I thought were long gone. And it also renewed my sort of spark then. So I remember specifically Indonesian feeling like, wow, I did that. Like, it's been so long, and I was able to just talk and have a decent conversation. Like, yeah, let's do more Indonesian. And so it was this nice check-in point for everything in one go. So yeah, I recommend.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And I think in general, actually, videoing yourself, what I think one of the kind of, it's not a profound regret, but something from my Erasmus year, for example, I wish I videoed myself at least at the end of the year, if not kind of both, to see the progress, but specifically at the end of the year, because of course, that I did Italian at uni, and I did a whole year studying in Verona. And it was that where I thought, I wish I still had video evidence of how good I was, because, that was so long ago now that my knowledge of it has faded a lot because I don't use it very much. Whereas, doing something like that, it's kind of affirming in the moment, because you go, wow, how many languages was it in total that you switched between on that day? I
think on that day, it was either 12 or 13. I can't remember exactly.
So that's proof in itself, isn't it? Whether you video it or not.
Well, yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
Are you able to kind of fill us in on how you got to that number from
the gap between where we were?
Yeah. You just imagine, another 5.
Yeah. So it was French and then Spanish, and then with the university it was then Italian, Mandarin, Chinese, and German.
Okay.
So then we're at 5. And then after that, then the first language that I kind of studied completely solo was Dutch, because I'd started the blogging side of the business sort of, I want to say it was 2 years in, so maybe 2014, when I was sort of beginning to move online. And I'm thinking, well, how do I reach people online? I make something of this website that I've just had sat there for 2 years. Let's actually, put something on it. And I thought, well, if I'm going to write about language learning, I kind of need to be language learning. And I didn't just want to write about, I am learning French for my degree, and in the book it says this. That felt separate to me. And so I wanted it to be something new, a new experience for me that I could write about and discover what it is like to learn a language completely on your own from scratch. So I did Dutch with that. And I got decent enough. Now, like we're saying, right, that's probably one of the weaker ones, because it's probably one of the earlier ones. Right. So it was Dutch, and then I did Portuguese in that same summer.
Brazilian or European?
Why does everyone always ask that?
The eternal question.
Yeah, but why? No one ever asks it for French. Was it Quebecois or Parisian?
So right.
It's so weird. But I know there are differences, but I just kind of had lessons with both. Okay. So it's probably an island in the middle of the Atlantic where it's just population 1 and I'm speaking Portuguese. Okay. So yeah, a bit of a mixture. But Portuguese. And then after that, I kind of lose track of exactly what order, but then I think it was Japanese, and then maybe Indonesian, Esperanto I did for a bit, Korean, and around the same time as Korean was Guarani. And then Bulgarian I learned for a while, a really short time, 6 weeks before a short trip there. And I was amazed at how good I got. I really went for it with that time. I had lessons basically every day. I had a book out from the library. I just did as much as I could in the short little bursts. But I think as well that
these one-to-one lessons every day that you did with a teacher.
Yeah, more or less every day. And yeah, I always find it interesting. I think the quicker that you learn, the quicker it departs your brain, unless you keep going. Right. But yeah, I did a bit of Bulgarian. And then after that, maybe that was when I kind of, I think I started Russian. Yeah, and then I started the masters, and then I started Russian after I'd started kind of a few months after. Okay. Knowing that's going to be slow because I'm doing this whole master's thing. And yeah, from then that was Russian for a bit. And then this year I started learning Arabic, which I'd very briefly kind of dabbled with before. But I did it for a few months kind of at the start of the year, but I've sort of put that on pause now because I'm learning Turkish, because kind of coming back to the Langathon and the marathon, I've signed up to run Istanbul Marathon. And so, so I'm like, well, that's a good reason to learn Turkish, because I'm going to go.
Great.
So yeah, so that's kind of where I am now, I think. I don't think I've missed anything out.
That's incredible. And I think what's really interesting about your story is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you've done this all from England. Is that correct?
Yeah. I've never like lived, and I lived in Costa Rica when I was 18 for 3 months.
Right.
And then the longest I've ever been anywhere in one go, I spent 6 weeks in Mexico, 3 weeks in Peru, 3 weeks in Paraguay, and that was like part of like a longer trip in Latin America. But then I've never like lived abroad, you know, in one place. So yeah, basically all from England. Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's proof of the effectiveness of your method, or methods, I should say, because no doubt you're in agreement that, you know, the methods that we use, it depends on the language that we're learning, what we're learning for, all that sort of stuff. Would you say that's the case?
Yeah, I'd say the most important factor that it depends on is yourself. If you want to learn Chinese, if you want to learn Spanish, if you have that drive, go and do it. If you've got your Shakira laundry service CD equivalent in Spanish 2023 world or in Chinese, then by all means follow that drive. But if actually you think, oh, Chinese, I don't know if that's for me, I'm not sure if I'm interested, then find something else, because 7,000 languages in the world, like there's no reason to be bored. There's always going to be something to do.
I think that's such a great message, especially kind of in line with this conference's focus on minority languages, endangered languages. It's about, you know, not thinking what's going to be the most useful, because that won't ultimately drive you forward. It's what lights your fire, right?
Yeah.
So it would be great to hear a bit about, you know, your experience with Guarani, for example. And I know as well, if you could tell us about your recent feature on, it was a BBC program, wasn't it, that you were on?
Yeah.
It would be great to hear about that and what you did with that.
Yeah, I was always kind of intrigued by, I suppose, from when I did my degree with the Open University. I remember that was my first kind of encounter with Guarani, where there was this whole kind of chapter or section about languages that live alongside Spanish. And I was like, oh, this is so interesting, because you don't always get taught that stuff. It's just very much like, Mark is on his business trip to Madrid. If he's not in Madrid, he's in Barcelona. If he's not in Barcelona, he's in Mexico City. Like, there's nowhere else in the Spanish-speaking world. Like, that is it. And so it's always kind of intriguing when you get the chance to discover about other things that exist alongside that. And so yeah, that's when I first learned about Guarani. I'd heard of, like, I think there was maybe a bit about Quechua and Catalan, but this really intrigued me to the point that I wrote my final Spanish dissertation for that degree about languages that live alongside Spanish and places where that happens. So I wrote about Barcelona and Catalonia, and Catalan and Spanish and how they coexist. I wrote about the USA and how Spanish coexists with English and many other languages, but primarily focus on English. And I wrote about Paraguay, because actually it was this really unique case of an indigenous language in the form of Guarani and Spanish, the colonizer language, where typically what happens is the colonizer language comes in, say goodbye to the indigenous languages, they're probably going to be gone. But it's not always the case. And obviously there's many like really, really great revitalization and revival efforts around the world. But that is unfortunately what has happened in a lot of cases. And with Guarani, you know, it's not to say that it's always been an easy path, but I was really intrigued at how it had become an official language alongside Spanish. How people had this pride, even non-Indigenous, you know, there's like 10% Indigenous population, yet something like 90% of the population speak Spanish and Guarani to some level. And so I was like, well, how did this happen? It's so curious. And so when I was then when I knew I was then going to travel to Latin America, and I'm thinking, oh, this is a good opportunity to learn a new language. Quechua, Yucatec Maya, Guarani, that's the one, because it's going to be kind of at the end, so I have more time. And I had this intrigue that had lingered from a year or so before. And so, yeah, I decided to just see what I could do there. And there was not like the typical resources that you'd always find. Like, you can't just like Amazon.com, teach yourself Guarani or complete Guarani, colloquial Guarani. Like, no, like right. The only thing I could buy in terms of books from the internet, nothing in shops, from the UK was a dictionary. That was it. That was the only thing. And I was like, well, I can just dictionary on the internet. But there were these little nuggets where I did find, like, there is a Duolingo course, for example, in Guarani taught through Spanish. There was, at the time at least, but not now, at least not as I'm recording, there was a tutor on italki, but just one, right? So there were these little nuggets. On Closemaster, there's Guarani. So these places where you wouldn't necessarily expect, but you might typically look when you're starting a new language. Mm-hmm. These little gems were coming out. And so I had very few resources to work with, but that created this whole new experience of, well, actually, I need to be even more in charge of this than I've ever been with any other language. Like, it's so easy, isn't it, to just open the book, it's chapter 1, what's it asking me to do today? And like, just do it in order the book says.
So did you find yourself making your own resources then?
Not so much making my own resources, but just utilizing what I did have, like, differently. And the way that I've always described that since is, it's like, if you think of every resource like a sponge that is full of water, you can kind of go bloop and give it a little squeeze and just get a little something out of it, or you can really, really wring that sponge dry. And that's what I had to do for Guarani.
That's such a good analogy.
So yeah, when there was like the Live Lingual project, where there's loads and loads of free PDFs of I always get the initials wrong. I think it's the DLI, the Peace Corps, and the FSI, I think are the initial ones. And there was one there from the Peace Corps for Guarani. So I had this old PDF that I downloaded, and I'm like, just getting the basic dialogues and stuff. I'm like, okay, so how would I then, you know, based on what I've learned from Duolingo, how does that all fit together, and what does that look like now? And that experience of learning a language with very few resources available to me than what you typically have really made me learn languages better in the long run, because I then applied everything that I'd learned from that to every other language, right? So, you know, you want to learn French and you go into Waterstones and it's like bombardment. Where do you begin?
Then you get choice fatigue.
Like, well, actually, if you just go, okay, I want this one, or you just take what you have, like, you know, from a secondhand shop or whatever. I'm a big fan of like secondhand language books. That's my like collection that I have, is like, I always just, you know, try and find something. I'm like, yes, you're coming home with me. Let's go. And then to be able to then adapt and to mold that resource into what you want or need it to be, because there's so much as well on the internet. Like, I like to have a physical book, but also I know that, like, if I want to check something, and now Google Translate exists for Guarani. They did a huge language ad last year. I think they added like 100 languages or something, and now it exists. It's not bad. And so there's like all of these things are now, you know, appearing, and it's really great to see. So that had always been something I was curious about. I'd, a few years ago now, volunteered for a little bit with Wikitongues, always been a huge supporter of their work as well. And so, yeah, when the BBC video, they just emailed me totally out of the blue and said, would you be able to talk about this? And I was like, yes, this is like in my wheelhouse. I don't know if they even really knew that was quite like my, you know, core topic that I love to get into. So yeah, it was just quite a nice chance to really share that with sort of wider audience.
Yeah, so great. And where was the filming for it?
In the UK, down in Exeter.
Okay.
in the studios of the company that made it.
That's so
Preston
great.
Street Films. They're very good.
Okay, great. And where would we be able to watch that then?
It's on the BBC Ideas website.
Mhm.
I can share a link with you. Maybe, I don't know
That
if
would
there's
be
links
great.
below.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always wonder about the BBC in terms of, trying to view that outside of the UK. So, if
Yeah,
you do put the
I
link
don't
up
know.
and it's not accessible, apologies. But
Yeah.
maybe there's a way with, I don't know, VPNs or something.
Yeah.
That's so interesting. So I have just a couple more questions. One of them is, obviously this is going to be aired during Global. We are in Global now, technically. So I don't know whether you have already done your talk or you're about to do your talk, but could you tell us a little bit about it, please?
Yeah, it's actually this is a nice follow on, because it's actually going to be based on my master's dissertation, which was about Guarani, and in particular about social media and language learning. And I was really intrigued by how, when I'd been learning Guarani, one of the things that had been really useful was social media, and just finding the odd Instagram account here and there, or the odd teacher that had a Facebook page, or a group on Facebook, and being able to just kind of be in those spaces and follow those people and kind of see the language a little bit more in different contexts, I found really helpful. And I wondered how I wondered two things to begin with. I wondered how the learners found this experience, and I wondered how we'll call them teachers, the people that created these pages and these spaces, how they found the experience too. In the end, it was a focus on the page creators, and it was really interesting because, like, a lot of them said that they didn't think people were necessarily learning seriously, or they kind of just would see things and keep scrolling. And I thought, oh, that's such a shame, because there's a lot of ways that, like I just said to you, it's like the sponge, right? There's a lot more ways that you can use that stuff. And people are working really hard to create countless resources and things out there on social media for a whole host of languages. And I was like, oh, if people aren't necessarily using them effectively, then what is that? It's just a sort of additional documentation of the language. But I feel like there's more we can be doing with that in terms of learning as well. And so, yeah, that's what the session is about. It's about expanding on the dissertation and the ways that we can use social media for language learning in more effective ways, especially with that focus on languages where there's sort of lesser studied languages, not necessarily indigenous or minority or endangered.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? I find social media such a double-edged sword, because I think it's created so many opportunities for exposure to, languages, whether popular languages or particular dialects or minority languages. And at the same time, because of the nature of our attention's being pulled every which way. So it sounds like a really, really important project.
Yeah. I'm excited to share it for sure.
Great. My last question was, what does the future hold? Where's Lindsay Does Languages going? Where are you going? What are your plans for the foreseeable future?
It's a good question. So right now, these past couple of years, I guess, have been kind of restabilizing everything post-COVID and all of that stuff. And I'm trying to think about when this will go out and what will exist by that point.
Okay. So it's going to be beginning of October, isn't it? Yeah.
Beginning of October. Okay, so it will probably be just before what I'm about to share. So I mentioned about the Langathon, and part of the Langathon over the past couple of years has been this event, this virtual retreat that I've hosted called Grace and Space. Which, like I said, it didn't happen in May this year, but I'm bringing it to the autumn instead. So hopefully it won't be as hot and humid as it is today. But yeah, so that will be happening mid-October, and then just continuing to work with people in language life and in the online teaching starter kit, in sort of growing all of those things. And watch this space. There's some things that I'm not gonna say just yet, just in case. But yeah.
And then, okay, just before we go, my last question then is the language marathon. Is that something that you kind of came up with as a concept? Do other people do that? Are there opportunities for other people to get involved, or is it kind of a movement that you would like to perhaps share and just encourage people to organize for themselves?
Yeah, like by all means, do it when you want to do it. I might host one again sort of before the year ends. So we've had a 2023, and then we can say, yes, this is annual since it began. But yeah, we'll see how it goes. And whenever it happens, whenever I host one, it's always open, so people can join in and do it for themselves. And also, like, I know that sometimes there is that element of multilingualism where people want to learn and then practice multiple languages. But I think for other people, there's also, I just want to make it really clear that that doesn't have to be the case. Like, if you want to just really go all in on one language for the day, you can do that too. There's no strict rule that says you have to do at least 12 languages or anything like that. It's very much open to determining what it looks like for you as well. So yeah, whenever it opens up next, feel free to join.
That's great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lindsay. That was really, really interesting. I feel like I've learned so much from you, and I'm sure viewers will as well. Is there any final thing that you want to add before we go?
No, just to let people know, if you have any questions, you can always email me. It's lindsay@doeslanguages.com. And yeah, everything you need to know is on the website too, lindsay.doeslanguages.com.
And of course, we'll add links in the description and things as well. Thank you so much, Lindsay. It's been a pleasure.
No problem. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.